schizophrenia, a fracturing of reality itself, where the brain that builds your world begins constructing something entirely different. Voices emerge from silence, speaking truths only you can hear. Certainties form that no evidence can shake. The boundaries between self and other, real and imagined, dissolve into terrifying confusion. For centuries, we called it possession, madness, divine punishment. We locked people away in asylums, sterilized them, murdered them. Then came the revolution, medications that could quiet the chaos, community care that promised dignity. Yet even now, the mystery remains unsolved. 80% unemployment, 15 years of lost life, families shattered, millions imprisoned instead of treated. But also stories of recovery that defy every prediction, revealing resilience where science saw only deterioration. This is the complete science of schizophrenia, the disease that asks the most profound question of all: what makes reality real? Before we begin, if you enjoy these types of interesting science topics, hit the like button, comment, and tell us where you are listening from. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know what to do. Simply subscribe. The story of schizophrenia begins in the space between mind and reality, in the moment when the brain's construction of the world diverges from consensus experience. Unlike diseases that invade from outside or result from simple deficiencies, schizophrenia emerges from within the intricate architecture of the human brain itself, a condition where the very organ responsible for perceiving and interpreting reality malfunctions in ways that fundamentally alter what a person experiences as real. Schizophrenia has existed throughout human history and across all cultures, though it has been understood and interpreted in vastly different ways. Ancient texts from diverse civilizations describe individuals exhibiting behaviors consistent with what we now call schizophrenia. Hearing voices no one else hears, believing things others find impossible, speaking in disorganized ways, withdrawing from social connection. In many pre-modern societies, these experiences were interpreted through spiritual or religious frameworks. People hearing voices might be understood as receiving messages from gods or spirits. Some cultures saw certain manifestations as gifts rather than illnesses, with affected individuals sometimes occupying roles as shamans or oracles. The origins of schizophrenia as a recognized medical entity date to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Emil Kraepelin, a German psychiatrist, distinguished what he called dementia praecox, or early dementia, from other forms of mental illness, observing that certain patients becoming ill in adolescence or early adulthood showed progressive deterioration. Eugen Bleuler later coined the term schizophrenia, from Greek words meaning split mind, to describe the fragmentation of thought, emotion, and behavior he observed. Bleuler recognized that the condition did not always follow a deteriorating course and identified what he called the 4 A's. Associations meaning disordered thinking, affect meaning inappropriate emotional responses, ambivalence, and autism meaning withdrawal from reality. The genetic contribution to schizophrenia is substantial but complex. Family studies consistently show that schizophrenia runs in families. If one identical twin develops schizophrenia, the other twin has roughly a 40 to 50% chance of also developing the condition. Children with one parent affected have roughly a 10 to 15% risk. Yet the fact that even identical twins are not 100% concordant proves that genes alone do not determine outcome. Modern genetic research reveals that schizophrenia involves hundreds of genetic variants, each contributing small amounts of risk. Many involve genes important for brain development, synaptic function, and immune system regulation. This genetic complexity raises an evolutionary puzzle. If schizophrenia impairs functioning and reduces reproductive success, why have the associated genetic variants persisted? One possibility is that genes increasing schizophrenia risk may confer advantages in other contexts. Some research suggests that relatives of people with schizophrenia show enhanced creativity or cognitive flexibility. Another theory suggests that the genetic variants may be byproducts of selection for other traits, particularly the complex language and social cognitive abilities that define human cognition. The origins of schizophrenia in any individual begin not at symptom onset but much earlier, often during prenatal development and early life. Maternal infection during pregnancy, particularly during the second trimester, increases risk. Maternal malnutrition and obstetric complications, including birth hypoxia, have been linked to elevated risk. Growing up in urban environments is associated with increased schizophrenia risk compared to rural settings. Migration, particularly for ethnic minority groups facing discrimination, is associated with elevated risk. Childhood adversity, including abuse, neglect, and trauma, increases risk substantially. Cannabis use, particularly heavy use beginning in adolescence, has been consistently associated with increased schizophrenia risk. The convergence of these diverse risk factors points to schizophrenia as a neurodevelopmental disorder, one where disruptions during critical periods of brain development create vulnerabilities that manifest years or decades later. The brain regions most consistently implicated in schizophrenia, particularly those involving the prefrontal cortex and its connections to other regions, are among the last to fully mature, not reaching adult patterns until the mid-20s. This protracted development may explain why schizophrenia typically emerges in late adolescence or early adulthood rather than in childhood. The origins thus lie in a complex developmental process shaped by genetic vulnerability, prenatal and early life environmental factors, and the extended maturation of brain circuits during adolescence and early adulthood. The condition does not have a single cause but emerges from the interaction of multiple risk factors operating across different timescales. From the evolutionary maintenance of risk genes through the immediate biological consequences of brain development gone awry. The formation of schizophrenia unfolds across years, often beginning with subtle changes that only in retrospect appear as harbingers of the profound disruption to come. The prodromal phase represents the period before the first full psychotic episode, when early warning signs begin appearing. This phase typically lasts months to years and is characterized by subtle changes in thinking, perception, emotion, and behavior that do not yet reach the intensity of psychosis, but mark a departure from previous functioning. During this time, individuals may experience attenuated psychotic symptoms, odd beliefs that do not yet solidify into fixed delusions, unusual perceptual experiences that fall short of full hallucinations, or brief episodes of confusion about what is real. These experiences are often transient and may be dismissed as stress, adolescent turmoil, or personality quirks. Alongside these subtle psychotic-like experiences, the prodromal phase often brings changes in mood and motivation. Depression and anxiety are common. Motivation and energy decline, with individuals losing interest in activities they previously enjoyed. Social withdrawal begins, with the person spending more time alone and gradually disconnecting from friends and social networks. Academic or occupational functioning may begin declining. The challenge of the prodromal phase is that these symptoms are nonspecific. Many adolescents and young adults experience mood problems, social difficulties, or declining motivation without ever developing schizophrenia. Identifying who is in a true prodromal phase remains extremely difficult, though specialized clinics have developed approaches to identify and support individuals showing these early signs. Early intervention during this phase may help prevent or delay transition to full psychosis in some cases. The transition from prodromal symptoms to first episode psychosis often appears sudden, though closer examination usually reveals escalation over days to weeks. Attenuated symptoms intensify into frank psychosis. Odd beliefs crystallize into fixed, unshakable delusions. Unusual perceptual experiences become vivid, persistent hallucinations. Disorganized thinking progresses to thought patterns so disrupted that communication becomes difficult or impossible. This first psychotic break is often terrifying and confusing for both the individual experiencing it and those around them. Hallucinations in schizophrenia most commonly involve hearing voices, though hallucinations can affect any sensory modality. Auditory hallucinations of voices are experienced as coming from outside the person's own thoughts, often commenting on the person's behavior, conversing with each other about the person, or commanding the person to do things. The voices can be male or female, familiar or unfamiliar, single or multiple. They range from barely audible whispers to loud, intrusive shouting. The content varies widely, but often includes critical, threatening, or disturbing material. Delusions are fixed, false beliefs that persist despite evidence to the contrary. Common themes include persecutory delusions, where the person believes they are being followed, monitored, or targeted. Referential delusions, where ordinary events are interpreted as having special personal significance. Grandiose delusions involving beliefs about having special powers or mission. And delusions of control, where the person believes their thoughts or actions are being controlled by external forces. The specific content often reflects cultural context, with modern delusions frequently involving technology like surveillance devices or implanted chips, while historical cases involved religious themes more prominently. Disorganized thinking manifests in speech patterns where the logical connections between ideas become loose or absent. Severe disorganization produces tangential speech where responses veer away from questions, or frank word salad where speech becomes an incomprehensible jumble. The person's experience is often that their thoughts race, jump around, or are somehow interfered with, described as thought insertion, where thoughts seem to come from outside, thought withdrawal, where thoughts seem taken away, or thought broadcasting, where private thoughts seem accessible to others. Alongside these dramatic positive symptoms, negative symptoms often worsen during the first episode. Affective flattening describes reduced emotional expression, with diminished facial expressions and reduced vocal intonation. Alogia refers to poverty of speech. Avolition describes decreased motivation and inability to initiate or sustain goal-directed activities. Anhedonia is the reduced ability to experience pleasure, contributing to social withdrawal. Cognitive impairments, while less obvious than positive symptoms, are often substantial. Problems with attention and concentration make it difficult to follow conversations or focus on tasks. Working memory deficits impair problem-solving and planning. Executive function impairments affect abstract thinking and cognitive flexibility. Processing speed is often reduced. The emergence of first episode psychosis typically prompts initial contact with mental health services, though the path to treatment is often indirect and delayed. The period of untreated psychosis, from symptom onset to beginning effective treatment, varies widely, but often extends months or even years, and longer duration is associated with poorer outcomes. The formation of schizophrenia thus involves a progressive process from subtle prodromal symptoms through dramatic emergence of psychosis, with the full syndrome becoming apparent when positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms coalesce into a pattern that substantially impairs functioning. Schizophrenia does not spread between people, but the term progression remains apt for describing how the condition evolves within individuals over time. The course is highly variable, with some people experiencing a single episode followed by complete recovery, others experiencing repeated relapses interspersed with periods of relative stability, and still others facing chronic, persistent symptoms with progressive functional decline. Following the first psychotic episode, the immediate course depends heavily on whether and how quickly effective treatment is initiated. Antipsychotic medications, by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain, typically reduce positive symptoms within days to weeks, though full response may take longer, and negative and cognitive symptoms respond less completely. The acute phase of a psychotic episode is characterized by the prominence of positive symptoms and significant functional impairment. During this time, the person may be unable to work, attend school, or manage independent living. As positive symptoms respond to treatment, the person enters a stabilization phase where symptoms diminish but may not completely resolve. During this period, the person gradually regains some functioning, but often continues experiencing attenuated symptoms and significant difficulties with motivation, emotion, cognition, and social functioning. Many people experience what is sometimes called post-psychotic depression, a period of low mood, anxiety, and adjustment to the implications of having experienced psychosis. The stable or maintenance phase follows stabilization, characterized by relative symptom control with treatment, but often persistent negative and cognitive symptoms, even when positive symptoms are largely controlled. Many people in this phase continue experiencing auditory hallucinations or retaining delusional beliefs, but develop ability to recognize these as symptoms and reduce their impact on behavior. Functioning during this phase varies enormously between individuals. The relapse rate in schizophrenia is substantial. Without ongoing treatment, roughly 80% of people experience another psychotic episode within 5 years of their first episode. With maintenance medication, relapse rates drop to roughly 20 to 30% over similar periods. Factors increasing relapse risk include medication non-adherence, substance use, stressful life events, social isolation, and inadequate psychosocial support. The long-term course of schizophrenia follows several general patterns. Roughly 15 to 20% of people experience a single episode or a few episodes with good recovery between episodes and minimal long-term impairment. Another 25 to 30% experience multiple episodes, but maintain relatively good functioning between episodes. The remaining 50 to 60% experience more chronic courses, with frequent relapses, persistent symptoms, and significant ongoing functional impairment despite treatment. Factors associated with better outcomes include acute rather than insidious onset, later age at onset, good premorbid functioning before illness, strong social support, absence of substance use, short duration of untreated psychosis, and good response to initial treatment. Factors associated with poorer outcomes include early age at onset, insidious onset with long prodromal phase, poor premorbid adjustment, prominent negative symptoms, cognitive impairment, substance use, and treatment resistance. Negative symptoms often prove more persistent and disabling than positive symptoms. Even when hallucinations and delusions are controlled with medication, many people continue struggling with motivation, emotional expression, social connection, and experiencing pleasure. These symptoms profoundly impact quality of life and functioning, but respond less robustly to current treatments. Cognitive impairments similarly persist and significantly limit functional recovery. Difficulties with attention, memory, processing speed, and executive function interfere with work, education, and independent living even when psychotic symptoms are controlled. Suicide represents a devastating outcome for approximately 5 to 6% of people with schizophrenia, a rate far higher than in the general population. Suicide risk is particularly elevated during the first few years after diagnosis and during and shortly after psychotic episodes, depression, hopelessness about the future, good insight into having a chronic illness, substance use, and previous suicide attempts all increase risk. The progression of schizophrenia reflects the heterogeneity of the condition. What we call schizophrenia may represent multiple distinct conditions with different underlying mechanisms that we cannot yet distinguish. Understanding why some people recover while others experience chronic disability, despite similar symptoms and treatment, remains one of the fundamental mysteries of schizophrenia and a critical focus for research seeking to improve outcomes. The history of schizophrenia is inseparable from the history of how societies have understood and responded to severe mental illness. Across cultures and throughout recorded history, people exhibiting symptoms we would now recognize as schizophrenia have been present, but the interpretations, treatments, and social responses have varied dramatically. In ancient and medieval periods, severe mental disturbances were most commonly interpreted through supernatural or spiritual frameworks. In many European societies, behaviors consistent with schizophrenia were attributed to demonic possession, witchcraft, or divine punishment. People experiencing hallucinations or delusions might be subjected to exorcisms, religious rituals, or persecution. The Arabic and Islamic medical traditions developed more naturalistic approaches, recognizing it as a medical condition and establishing some of the earliest psychiatric hospitals beginning in the 8th century. The rise of asylums in Europe and North America from the 17th through 19th centuries represented a shift toward medical and institutional approaches, though the reality often fell far short of therapeutic ideals. Early asylums were frequently overcrowded, underfunded custodial institutions where people with schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses were confined, often for life, with minimal treatment. Conditions in many asylums were appalling, with patients subjected to neglect, abuse, and experimental treatments. The eugenic movement brought additional horrors, with people diagnosed with schizophrenia subjected to forced sterilization in many countries, and ultimately, under Nazi Germany, mass murder. The mid-20th century brought revolution in understanding and treating schizophrenia. The discovery of chlorpromazine's antipsychotic effects in the early 1950s, followed by development of other antipsychotic medications, represented the first treatments that could effectively reduce positive symptoms. This pharmacological breakthrough, combined with growing recognition of human rights violations endemic in large psychiatric institutions, catalyzed the deinstitutionalization movement beginning in the 1960s. Deinstitutionalization, the process of closing large psychiatric hospitals and moving care to community settings, was driven by multiple factors, including new medications, making community treatment more feasible, emerging human rights frameworks, and economic motivations. The outcomes have been mixed. In settings where deinstitutionalization was accompanied by adequate development of community mental health services, many people achieved better quality of life. However, in many places, institutional beds were eliminated without corresponding development of community services, leading to homelessness, incarceration in jails and prisons, and inadequate care. Cross-cultural research has revealed both universal and culturally specific aspects of schizophrenia. The core symptoms of hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorder appear across all studied cultures, suggesting biological universals. However, the specific content and interpretation of symptoms show striking cultural variation. Delusions in Western societies often involve technology and government surveillance, while in other cultural contexts they may center on witchcraft, spirits, or local religious beliefs. The World Health Organization international studies produced surprising findings about outcomes across cultures. People with schizophrenia in developing countries appeared to have better long-term outcomes than those in developed Western nations, with higher rates of recovery and better social functioning, despite less access to psychiatric medication. Various explanations have been proposed, including stronger family and community support systems in traditional societies, different illness concepts that may reduce stigma, more opportunities for meaningful social roles in agricultural versus industrial economies, and potentially protective factors in traditional healing practices. The global burden of schizophrenia falls disproportionately on low and middle-income countries, where the majority of people with the condition live, but where resources for treatment are most limited. The treatment gap is vast in many regions. In some low-income countries, over 90% of people with schizophrenia receive no treatment. Barriers include lack of trained mental health professionals, unavailability of medications, poverty preventing access to care, stigma deterring help seeking, and health systems prioritizing other conditions over mental health. Stigma surrounding schizophrenia remains intense globally. In many societies, schizophrenia and severe mental illness carry profound social stigma, leading to discrimination in employment, housing, and social relationships. People with schizophrenia may be viewed as dangerous, unpredictable, or morally flawed. This stigma compounds the direct effects of illness, creating barriers to treatment, social isolation, and internalized shame. The criminalization of mental illness has become a major concern in many countries, particularly the United States, where deinstitutionalization without adequate community services has led to large numbers of people with schizophrenia ending up in jails and prisons rather than receiving appropriate treatment. Behaviors arising from untreated psychosis, combined with homelessness and survival strategies in the absence of support, lead to arrest and incarceration. Once involved in the criminal justice system, people with schizophrenia face barriers to treatment, housing, and services that make recovery more difficult. The contemporary experience of schizophrenia varies dramatically depending on where a person lives, what resources they can access, and how their family and community respond to their illness. In high-income countries with developed mental health systems, the typical trajectory involves recognition of symptoms, psychiatric evaluation, diagnosis, initiation of treatment with antipsychotic medication, and connection to varying levels of ongoing support services. Yet even in these relatively resource-rich settings, the quality and adequacy of care varies immensely. The lived experience of schizophrenia is profoundly disorienting and frightening, particularly during acute psychotic episodes. Hearing voices that seem completely real, commenting on your actions, insulting you, or commanding you to do things creates overwhelming distress. For the person experiencing this, these voices are not perceived as products of their own mind, but as external, real presences. The content of voices is often disturbing, critical, or threatening. Some people develop strategies for coping with voices, learning to ignore them or talk back to them, while others remain tormented despite treatment. Delusions create a reality where the impossible seems not only possible but certain. A person might be absolutely convinced they are being monitored by government agencies, that their thoughts are being broadcast to others, that they have special powers or a divine mission, or that ordinary events hold profound personal significance. No amount of contrary evidence can shake these beliefs during acute illness. The person experiences the delusion not as a strange thought, but as obvious truth. The loss of shared reality that psychosis creates isolates people profoundly. When your experiences of hearing voices or your beliefs about being persecuted are not validated by others, when people you trust tell you that things you are certain about are not real, the cognitive dissonance is intense. Many people experiencing first episode psychosis describe feeling like they are going crazy, sensing that something is terribly wrong but unable to trust their own perceptions or others' reassurances. For families and friends, watching someone develop schizophrenia is heartbreaking and confusing. A person who was previously functioning well begins changing in ways that are initially subtle but progressively more concerning. They may become withdrawn, suspicious, or start expressing bizarre ideas. When psychosis fully emerges, families often struggle to get help, encountering systems that are difficult to navigate or that cannot provide care unless the person voluntarily seeks it, which they may refuse if they lack insight into being ill. Modern treatment for schizophrenia centers on antipsychotic medications, which block dopamine receptors in the brain and effectively reduce positive symptoms in most people. First-generation antipsychotics were effective but carried significant side effects, including movement disorders. Second-generation antipsychotics have different side effect profiles, with reduced risk of movement disorders, but increased risk of metabolic effects, including weight gain, diabetes, and elevated cholesterol. All antipsychotic medications carry significant side effects, and finding a medication and dose that controls symptoms with tolerable side effects often requires trial and error. Medication adherence is a major challenge. People may stop taking medications because of side effects, because they feel better and think they no longer need treatment, because they lack insight that they are ill, or because of access or cost barriers. Non-adherence dramatically increases relapse risk. Long-acting injectable antipsychotics help ensure medication delivery for people who struggle with daily oral medication. Beyond medication, psychosocial interventions are crucial for optimal outcomes. Cognitive behavioral therapy adapted for psychosis helps people develop coping strategies for symptoms. Family psychoeducation helps families understand the illness and support their relatives' recovery. Supported employment programs help people work with appropriate accommodations. However, access to these interventions is highly variable and often inadequate. Housing instability and homelessness affect people with schizophrenia at alarming rates. The combination of illness-related functional impairment, inadequate support services, poverty from inability to work, and discrimination in housing creates conditions where many people end up homeless. Once homeless, accessing consistent treatment becomes nearly impossible, and symptoms typically worsen. The recovery movement in mental health has challenged traditional pessimistic views of schizophrenia as inevitably chronic and deteriorating. Recovery, defined not necessarily as cure, but as living a meaningful, satisfying life despite ongoing symptoms, is increasingly recognized as an achievable goal. Factors supporting recovery include effective symptom management, stable housing, meaningful activity, social connection and support, reduced stigma, and hope. Some people who were initially severely ill go on to work, complete education, maintain relationships, and live independently. Life expectancy for people with schizophrenia is reduced by 15 to 20 years on average compared to the general population, driven by multiple factors including suicide, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disease, medication side effects, health risk behaviors including smoking, barriers to accessing medical care, and lack of integrated care. This mortality gap represents a human rights issue and a call to action for better integration of mental health and general medical care. Understanding what happens inside the brain during schizophrenia requires grappling with extraordinary complexity. The brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, forming trillions of connections, organized into networks that enable perception, thought, emotion, and behavior. Schizophrenia disrupts these networks in ways that remain incompletely understood despite decades of intensive research. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, proposed in the 1960s and refined over subsequent decades, remains central to understanding the neurobiology. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger that neurons use to communicate. The hypothesis proposes that excessive dopamine activity in certain brain regions contributes to positive symptoms. This theory emerged from observations that drugs increasing dopamine activity could induce psychotic symptoms, while drugs that blocked dopamine receptors reduced psychotic symptoms. Essentially, all effective antipsychotic medications work by blocking dopamine D2 receptors. However, current understanding suggests that schizophrenia involves dysregulation of dopamine rather than simple excess, with excessive dopamine activity in some brain regions, but reduced activity in others. Subcortical regions may show hyperactive dopamine transmission contributing to positive symptoms, while prefrontal cortex may show reduced dopamine function contributing to negative and cognitive symptoms. This regional variation helps explain why blocking dopamine reduces hallucinations and delusions, but does not improve, and may even worsen negative symptoms. Glutamate, another neurotransmitter, has received increasing attention. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, crucial for synaptic plasticity and learning. The glutamate hypothesis proposes that dysfunction in glutamate signaling, particularly involving NMDA receptors, contributes to the disorder. This hypothesis emerged from observations that drugs blocking NMDA receptors produce symptoms strikingly similar to schizophrenia, including positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms. Glutamate dysfunction may be upstream of dopamine dysregulation. Brain structure shows consistent abnormalities in schizophrenia, though these changes are subtle and variable. Structural neuroimaging studies have found slightly enlarged brain ventricles, suggesting reduced brain tissue volume. Gray matter volume is reduced in multiple regions, including prefrontal cortex, temporal cortex, and hippocampus. White matter shows abnormalities in organization and integrity. These structural changes are present at illness onset, suggesting they largely precede symptom emergence rather than resulting from chronic illness. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center responsible for planning, decision-making, attention, and working memory, is consistently implicated in schizophrenia. Functional neuroimaging shows abnormal prefrontal activation patterns. The connections between prefrontal cortex and other brain regions appear disrupted, contributing to disorganized thinking and cognitive impairment. The temporal lobe, particularly structures including the hippocampus and superior temporal gyrus, also shows consistent abnormalities. These regions are involved in memory and in processing auditory information, and their dysfunction may contribute to both memory impairments and auditory hallucinations. The formation of false memories and source monitoring errors, where internal thoughts are misattributed to external sources, may relate to hippocampal dysfunction. The concept of schizophrenia as a disorder of connectivity has gained prominence, proposing that the fundamental problem is not in specific brain regions, but in how regions communicate with each other. Functional connectivity studies show both reduced connectivity in some networks and excessive connectivity in others. Disrupted connectivity between frontal and temporal regions may underlie disorganized thinking and hallucinations. At the cellular level, schizophrenia involves multiple abnormalities, Postmortem studies show reduced dendritic spine density in prefrontal cortex, suggesting reduced synaptic connections. Abnormalities in inhibitory interneurons have been consistently observed. These interneurons help regulate and coordinate activity of excitatory neurons, and their dysfunction could lead to disorganized neural activity. The neurodevelopmental model proposes that schizophrenia originates in disruptions during early brain development that create vulnerabilities not immediately apparent, but that emerge when normal adolescent brain maturation processes expose the underlying dysfunction. Early developmental disruptions might affect neuronal migration, synapse formation, or circuit wiring, creating subtle abnormalities that become consequential only when the affected circuits are called upon to function at adult capacity. The immune system and inflammation have emerged as important factors. Elevated inflammatory markers are found in people with schizophrenia, particularly during acute psychosis. Maternal immune activation during pregnancy increases offspring schizophrenia risk. Some people have antibodies against brain proteins, suggesting autoimmune mechanisms. Mounting evidence suggests that at least in some cases, immune and inflammatory processes contribute to pathophysiology. How do these neurobiological disruptions produce the specific experiences of hallucinations and delusions? Hallucinations may result from abnormal, spontaneous activity in sensory processing regions, with activity in auditory cortex occurring without corresponding external sound, experienced as hearing voices. Delusions may emerge from abnormal salience attribution, where ordinary stimuli are assigned excessive significance by dysregulated dopamine systems, leading to searching for explanations that crystallize into fixed beliefs. Despite extensive research, fundamental questions remain unanswered. We still do not know what the core underlying deficit is, whether schizophrenia is one condition or multiple conditions that appear similar, why some people respond well to treatment while others remain resistant, or how to prevent onset. The brain mechanisms underlying negative symptoms and cognitive impairment remain particularly obscure and untreatable with current medications. The long-term burden of schizophrenia extends far beyond the individual experiencing the condition, radiating outward to families, communities, and societies while also reaching inward to affect every aspect of the affected person's life. For the individual, schizophrenia typically strikes during late adolescence or early adulthood, a critical period for education, career development, identity formation, and establishing independence. The onset of illness disrupts these developmental trajectories, often permanently altering life course. Educational attainment suffers as symptoms and treatment interfere with concentration and sustained effort. Many people leave school during or shortly after first episode. Career aspirations may be abandoned. Employment represents a major challenge. Unemployment rates exceed 80% in many settings. Multiple factors contribute. Cognitive impairments affecting job performance, negative symptoms reducing motivation and energy, positive symptoms potentially disrupting work, medication side effects, frequent medical appointments, episodic illness requiring time off, and employer discrimination. The result is poverty for most people who depend on disability benefits where available or on family support. Social relationships are profoundly affected. Many people experience progressive social isolation as symptoms, stigma, and illness consequences create barriers to forming and maintaining connections. Friendships from before illness may fade. Romantic relationships and marriage are less common, and those who do form relationships face additional stresses. The loneliness reported by many people with schizophrenia compounds other difficulties and undermines quality of life. Family burden is substantial and multifaceted. Parents, Siblings and partners often become primary caregivers, providing financial support, housing, help with daily living, accompaniment to appointments, and emotional support. The stress can be overwhelming, particularly when combined with grief over lost potential, worry about the future, exhaustion from crisis management, and frustration with inadequate mental health systems. The financial burden can be crushing, with families spending savings, going into debt, or impoverishing themselves trying to provide care. The psychological impact of living with schizophrenia includes not just direct symptom distress, but profound existential challenges. The diagnosis itself can be devastating, carrying implications of chronicity, disability, and stigma. Many people experience grief over lost possibilities, fear about the future, and shame from internalized stigma. The experience of psychosis can be traumatic, leaving lasting psychological scars. Stigma and discrimination compound other challenges. People with schizophrenia consistently report experiencing prejudice, rejection, and discrimination in multiple domains. The label itself carries profound stigma that can overshadow the person's identity. Self-stigma undermines self-esteem and hope for recovery. Structural stigma, embedded in policies and institutions, limits opportunities. The cumulative effect is decreased quality of life, reduced treatment seeking, and internalized hopelessness. Violence victimization is far more common than violence perpetration among people with schizophrenia. People with severe mental illness are many times more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators. Vulnerability stems from impaired judgment during illness, homelessness, substance use, and inability to protect themselves. Sexual assault, physical assault, robbery, and exploitation all occur at elevated rates. Physical health problems affect people with schizophrenia at higher rates and earlier ages than the general population. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disease, and infectious diseases all occur with greater frequency. Contributing factors include medication side effects, health risk behaviors including smoking and poor diet, barriers to accessing medical care, provider bias and lack of integrated care, and possibly shared biological vulnerabilities. The result is the shocking 15 to 20-year reduction in life expectancy. Substance use disorders affect roughly half of people with schizophrenia at some point, far higher than general population rates. People may use substances to cope with distressing symptoms, alleviate medication side effects, or address boredom and lack of meaningful activity. Substance use complicates treatment, increases relapse risk, worsens outcomes, and contributes to physical health problems. Homelessness affects people with schizophrenia at rates many times higher than the general population. Once homeless, maintaining treatment becomes nearly impossible. Symptoms worsen, vulnerability to victimization increases, and the likelihood of being able to exit homelessness diminishes. The visible presence of homeless people with untreated schizophrenia shapes public perceptions while obscuring the reality that homelessness is preventable with adequate housing and support services. The economic costs of schizophrenia are substantial at both individual and societal levels. Direct medical costs include medications, hospitalizations, clinic visits, and various services. Indirect costs from unemployment and lost productivity dwarf direct medical costs. Costs of criminal justice involvement, homelessness services, and disability benefits add further burden. Yet amid these overwhelming challenges, stories of recovery and resilience emerge. Some people, despite severe initial illness, go on to work, complete education, raise families, and live satisfying lives. Factors enabling recovery include effective treatment, stable housing, family and social support, meaningful activity, reduced stigma, personal resilience and hope. These success stories demonstrate what could be possible with better treatments and supports. Schizophrenia occupies a unique position in the landscape of human disease and experience, touching fundamental questions about consciousness, reality, and the nature of mind. More than most conditions, schizophrenia challenges our assumptions about what is real and how we know what we know. It reveals the constructed nature of the reality we inhabit, showing that what we experience as the world is actually a model built by our brains, and that when the building process goes wrong, radically different experiences emerge. The philosophical implications are profound. If hallucinations can be as vivid and convincing as genuine perceptions, what does this tell us about the nature of all perception? If delusions can be held with absolute certainty despite contrary evidence, what does this reveal about belief formation? Schizophrenia demonstrates that consciousness is not a window transparently revealing external reality, but a constructed model generated by brain processes that can fail or produce radically divergent versions of reality. The experience of people with schizophrenia challenges conventional boundaries between self and other, internal and external, real and imaginary. When thoughts seem broadcast to others, when external forces seem to control one's actions, when voices from outside comment on one's behavior, the boundaries that define individual selfhood become permeable and uncertain. These experiences raise questions about where the self resides, what constitutes personal identity, and how consciousness creates the unified sense of being a singular person distinct from the world. The neurodiversity perspective, emerging from disability rights and autism advocacy, has been extended to schizophrenia by some, proposing that experiences labeled as symptoms represent different ways of experiencing reality, rather than pure pathology. This view emphasizes that voice hearing and unusual beliefs occur in many people who are not distressed or functionally impaired, and that medicalizing these experiences may reflect social intolerance for difference. While controversial, particularly given the severe suffering many people experience, this perspective raises important questions about where to draw lines between disorder and difference. The tension between medical authority and personal autonomy creates profound ethical dilemmas in schizophrenia treatment. Many people experiencing psychosis lack insight that they are ill, experiencing their hallucinations and delusions as absolutely real. This creates situations where individuals refuse treatment they desperately need as judged by others but do not want as judged by themselves. How should societies balance protection of vulnerable people against respect for autonomy? When, if ever, should treatment be forced on people who refuse it? Laws regarding involuntary psychiatric treatment vary widely, but generally allow forced treatment when people pose imminent danger to themselves or others, or are gravely disabled. However, the application of these standards is fraught with difficulty. How imminent must danger be? How do we balance competing harms of forcing treatment against allowing illness to progress untreated? These questions have no easy answers and require balancing multiple values, including beneficence, autonomy, public safety, and resource limitations. The history of schizophrenia treatment includes numerous approaches that were ineffective at best and harmful at worst. Insulin coma therapy, lobotomy, and other interventions were attempted in desperation before effective medications existed. The history of forced treatment, often in the context of eugenic thinking or authoritarian abuse, created legitimate mistrust of psychiatric authority. This history must be reckoned with while also acknowledging that modern treatments, while imperfect, are vastly better than anything available previously. Scientific progress in understanding schizophrenia has been substantial, yet incomplete. The identification of dopamine's role, the development of effective medications, the mapping of genetic risk factors, the characterization of brain abnormalities, and the recognition of schizophrenia as a neurodevelopmental disorder all represent major advances. Yet fundamental questions remain unanswered. We still cannot predict who will develop schizophrenia, cannot prevent onset, cannot cure the condition, and cannot adequately treat negative symptoms and cognitive impairment. The search for better treatments continues along multiple paths. New medications targeting glutamate or other neurotransmitter systems are being developed. Non-pharmacological approaches, including various forms of psychotherapy, cognitive training, and brain stimulation techniques, are being refined and tested. Early intervention programs aiming to identify and treat people before full psychosis emerges show promise. Understanding the heterogeneity of schizophrenia and developing methods to match individuals to treatments most likely to help them represents an important direction for precision psychiatry. The question of whether schizophrenia will ever be cured remains open. The fact that a significant minority of people experience recovery, that early intervention can improve outcomes, and that the brain retains capacity for compensation and adaptation, all suggest that with better treatments and earlier intervention, outcomes could improve substantially, even if complete cure remains elusive. The social determinants of schizophrenia outcomes are increasingly recognized as crucial. Biology provides vulnerability, but social factors largely determine whether that vulnerability manifests as devastating disability or manageable challenge. Stable housing, adequate income, meaningful activity, social connection, good physical health care, and freedom from discrimination all substantially improve outcomes. The wide variation in outcomes between countries with similar medical technology but different social supports demonstrates that schizophrenia outcomes are not purely determined by neurobiology. Schizophrenia, ultimately, reveals truths about human vulnerability and resilience, about the fragility of consciousness and the robustness of human adaptation, about how societies treat those who are different. The condition challenges us to grapple with difficult questions about autonomy, care, and collective responsibility. It demonstrates the limits of purely biological approaches while also showing the power of neuroscience to illuminate mind and brain. It reveals deep inequities in who receives care and who suffers neglect. The complete science of schizophrenia encompasses neurobiology and phenomenology, genetics and social factors, treatment and lived experience. It is a story about brains and consciousness, about how reality is constructed and what happens when that construction fails. It is about the history of psychiatry and ongoing debates about the nature of mental illness. It is about stigma, human rights, and social justice. And it is about individual people, each with their own story, struggling with a condition that affects the most intimate aspects of their existence while navigating systems and societies that too often fail to provide the understanding, compassion, and support that human dignity demands.